Jacqui, and I'm an archaeologist, and I first went to the Outer Hebrides a long time ago, in the late 80s, when I was a PhD student. I went up there, and I guess I've been looking at animals and archaeology since then. So I'm what's called a zooarchaeologist, and zooarchaeologists are people, basically, it's the archaeology of animals. So we look at, I guess I do basically sort of the last 10,000 years. But one of the things, because I spent many years digging on the Hebrides, I did briefly go and hang out in the Isles of Scilly when my children were teenagers and complained too much about the weather on South Uist. But basically, I've been looking at the islands for a long time, and I look at the whole range of animals. So Sally, can you, hang on, before we move on, Sally's going to point at some things. So we're cheating slightly. I put some images from Scarabray on the top. So the little kind of smiley figure, which I don't really know what it is, I have to say. Whalebone is like this. That's how, I think that's made of sperm whale, as I think is the vessel, which you'll see on the other side, and they're both from Orkney, so you'll feel at home there, Jen. Underneath that, we have, underneath the little sort of figurine, there's a sperm whale tooth. And what's the tooth next to it, Sally?
That's the orca.
It is the orca, yeah.
Yeah.
And they were both recovered from the Hebrides, and the sperm whale's tooth is the single thing that I look at most often in the collection and think, if I could take one thing home, it would be that, because it's a Bronze Age sperm whale, and you can't go wrong with that, can you? And then in the middle, Sally, is a comb of some sort. Yeah, so a lot of the stuff you find on archaeological sites is there for, well, it's there for a variety of purposes, but what you'll see from this is quite a lot of it is used to make things, okay, or it's to do with what, you know, particularly what the animal looks like, okay. So we've got a whole variety of things that have been made into items, and then for the teeth are obviously the thing that's really obviously belongs to that species, particularly when it comes to sperm whale teeth. So go to the next slide, Sally. It'll be a surprise. Oh, here we are. So I've been working on the Hebrides for a long time digging, and this is just showing you, I guess, where the Hebrides are, which I'm sort of assuming most of you know where they are. And for those of you in Orkney, there's a little map showing you where Orkney is as well, just in case you don't know. And we've even got Shetland in on the larger map. And so at the bottom of Uist, South Uist, you can see there's a couple of sites mentioned. And the one we're going to be talking to, well, we're talking about two of them today. One is a site called Cladh Hallan, which is Bronze Age to early Iron Age, and the other one is Bornais, which actually goes from the Iron Age and right the way through to sort of the medieval period. But what happens there is the Norse arrive. So you might think of them as Vikings, but basically people come across from Scandinavia, most likely Norway, and they settle on the islands. So we've got sites that run right the way through time. Next slide, Sally. I like the way Ireland's missing from that map. So one of the things whenever we're thinking about, when I'm thinking about what do I do and look at archaeological sites, is we're always trying to think about how do kind of human and animals come together. So whilst part of it, we think quite a lot about the natural world and the environment, the other part of it is obviously we think about humans. So some of it's about the impacts that they might have on animals through hunting them or collecting them or gathering them, or it might be what animals mean to people, you know. So this is just a little image showing you a variety of sort of the techniques that we use to look at them. You know, so we'll look at pottery and residues and bones and all of these different things. And we kind of look at all this information. We try to understand what the heck is going on kind of in the past. And it's kind of a 360-degree review. So we try and think about everything, all time, all animals. So next slide, Sally. Yeah, so the best thing about the archaeology, basically, of the islands, and to some extent in particular in the Hebrides, some of the things I'm talking about, is that we have a long record, okay? So if you think about Britain, so basically Britain was reoccupied 7 times. The glaciers came down, everybody ran away. The glaciers went up, everybody came back. So they kind of in and out, in and out, in and out. But what we think that happened during this time was that every time a glacier came down, everybody left, and that included the animals, okay? So then what happens is as people come back in after the end of the Ice Age, then both animals and people, and indeed plants, actually reoccupy Britain. But what happens on the kind of islands is quite often they end up with fewer species, fewer terrestrial species than the mainland, because some of the species just don't get there. So that's why, for example, you don't see foxes on the Outer Hebrides today, because the foxes never actually got there. And some of the species that you do see, I mean, I don't know how many of you are aware of the hedgehog, anti-hedgehog campaign. So hedgehogs were not on the islands for a long period of time. The story is they were introduced by a school teacher in the 70s, who I have met and told me he did introduce them. The weird thing is, it's exactly the same story in the Isles of Scilly. It's the same guy going around sprinkling hedgehogs. But anyway, so what we have is we have this long record. We have people living there, and also we spend our time trying to sort of think of what arrived where and when, and how did people deal with living there. And obviously one of the great things about living on an island or a coast is you have both all the terrestrial resources, which obviously had to make their own way there, but you have everything that's living around you in the sea, which includes, you know, the mollusks, cetaceans, as well as crustaceans and various other things. So we look at what's there, and we also look at the bird life. And obviously there's very rich bird life, which people, again, used to exploit either to eat the birds or indeed to gather their eggs. So there's a long record we can see over time, and because there's so much little development, a lot of the archaeology is actually maintained in a fairly pristine manner. It's not, you know, it's not being built on. You know, in London, you see all the things being built on all the time. And this continuous occupation allows us to kind of see the changes over time. The other thing we have is they tend to build a lot of the structures kind of nicely out of stone, and the stone survives really well. It doesn't sort of rot away. And we actually get a really good preservation of sites. And there's a couple of reasons why we get good preservation of sites where we do. So if you know the Hebrides at all, there's a plain that runs down the west coast, which is made of maca. And maca is calcareous shell sand that blows onto the land at some time sort of around the Bronze Age, and actually forms this big kind of plain where today they grow all the crops and keep stock. But the chemical and physical properties of this sand are actually incredibly benign. So what happens is it's like appears to be like somebody's constantly sprinkling sand over the sites. So they tend to get sort of inundated and buried. Sometimes they're buried quite rapidly if there's storms and things. But basically the sites are kind of accumulating. So instead of somebody going in and kind of sweeping out their house and chucking everything out all the time or clearing stuff away, what we get is inside houses, you get all of the rubbish and it builds up. So people, instead of kind of clearing it out, they just keep building higher and higher and higher and higher. So some of the sites we have will have like generations. So there's one of the sites we're talking about, Cladh Hallan, has 16 generations of occupation in the house, where there's one house. That's about maybe 18 one house, 16 in total in the area, keeps getting lived in. So it's really good preservation. Where people drop things, they preserve, and chemically it's really benign, so the bone doesn't get destroyed, which is a very important thing because we've got lots of material. It doesn't get, you know, if it's in an acidic environment, you don't get any bone at all, which is the situation for the majority of whales, I'd like to point out. So we have really good material. We have really good sites, really good material. It's just a really great story that we can look at. We get lots of stuff. So we've been going there since, well, yes, the early 1990s. I went with Sheffield University to begin with when I was doing my PhD. And then I carried on going through the various iterations of my employment. I think I took students from Oxford, Winchester, Southampton, and somewhere else as well, as I kept swapping around. The sites are mostly settlements, just for information. So they aren't those sort of burial tombs where perhaps you get people putting special things. We're actually looking at what people did in their lives on a day-to-day basis, how they were living there. The other thing that's good about the sites is we dug so many of them that we dug them all the same way. So it's like a survey or anything. We used a standard method, which means it's really easy for us to compare things. The other thing that's happened, I guess, in the last, oh God, how many years is it now? 30 years now? Is kind of the appliance of science. I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of things like ancient DNA and those kind of projects that have emerged, or even modern DNA. There's now so many great methods, I'm going to talk to you about a bit about them, of actually understanding data. So it's kind of like what's happened over time is we've got much better interrogating tiny bits of data. Kind of in the old days, we used to just look at things and play snap to identify them. But now we have a whole series of methodologies, which we'll be talking to you about, which we can use to kind of like identify things at like a kind of biomolecular level, but, you know, things you need a big machine that goes ping for. There's been lots and lots of people who've worked on the projects over time, and Sally did her PhD on the site, so she is the expert, I have to say. So go on, Sally. Next slide. It'll be a surprise. Oh, this is just a slide. So it's showing you the sort of thing that goes on an archaeological site, kind of how long it takes. So we dug one. There's one site we took, one of the sites we talked about, basically for 9 years. You know, it took a very long time. We know the houses are rebuilt. You know, and it just shows you, and the little bit at the end shows you how long the site was occupied for, and just gives you an idea of the scale of the job of digging archaeological sites. They take a lot of effort, a lot of time to dig, and then they take a very long time to also then look at all the material we get. Because it says we've got like over 1 million remains of plants, 150,000 bits of animal bone, and then all the other stuff as well. The site is actually probably most famous. Next slide, Sally, I think has got the bodies, because it has a, oh no, I'll talk about why the site is famous. No, it's okay, you can go. I think there's another slide. So this is just showing you, you know, over time, we've got all of this information on the sites we look at from, I don't know what if you all know about kind of the narrative of what happens. So ultimately, what we have after kind of the end of the Ice Age is hunter-gatherers or gatherer-hunters. So there's people living in the UK and they don't farm, they just live on wild resources. We have a very small amount of evidence for the Mesolithic, which is this phase, in the Outer Hebrides, in the Orkneys, and kind of in Shetland. But I mean, it's a very small amount. You get more on the mainland. So we know there were some people there then, but when we get to farming, we know that people arrive and they definitely move up the west coast of Scotland and they're living on the islands. So I don't know, you can think about the famous site called the Nessa Brodka or Skara Brae, or those big sites that you get on Orkney. They're kind of that date. Okay. So we get people, we can see that people are there from the farmers onwards. And what we also know is from that time onwards, we also find whale bones. So Skara Brae is, for example, those like bits I showed you earlier, is one of these sites of like the early farmers. So right from the start, when we have good big records, we know that people have got whale bone on their sites. Okay, so we have lots of different species. We also know that they used to mostly eat kind of domestic mammals, so cattle, sheep, and pig, as you would imagine. And they also used to eat quite a lot of deer. And those of you who are aware, I mean, deer are still quite prevalent on on the mainland. In fact, they just keep increasing, and they're fairly common on the Outer Hebrides, actually. But they died out on Orkney, and we're not sure if there was ever a population on Shetland. Okay, next one. But wild species are important. That's what we're going to talk about today. I must have got rid of that slide, Sally. Never mind. So we're going to talk to you about two sites. So Cladh Hallan is a kind of Bronze Age, Iron Age. So that's like a prehistoric site. Okay. So these are the people who came after the first farmers, and what they have is they start to use metal. So the first farmers only had stone tools. They turned up, they had stone tools, they had pots, and they built big dooms and big settlements. By the time we get to the Bronze Age, they've got bronze. And in the case of Cladh Hallan, they've also got gold. There's some amazing bits of gold there. I didn't find them, I have to say. And then the other site you're looking at, Bornais, is not in the same spot. It's a little bit further up the islands, but that follows on from the Iron Age. And then later on, the Iron Age goes for quite a long time because the Romans never got across there. And then what you have is the appearance of the Norse. So, but what we do know is everybody who got there must have arrived there by boat in the first instance, and they must have taken all of their things with them. So one of the things we often think about is how do people get about? Do they go out on boats? Do they sail? And how do they move around? We know they must have sailed in the first instance to get there, or rowed. But it's interesting, boat evidence for boats is actually very rare across Britain. In the Bronze Age, there's a couple of big boats. There's like the Dover boat, but we don't have much information on boats in prehistory at all. But there's some log boats around and about. But we all know that the Norse people sailed over in boats, and we know that they definitely were at our sites because we find the clench nails, we find the nails left from the boats on the site. So whatever happens is they go there with their boats, and eventually they either use them to build roofs or whatever, but we know they're out there on the sea sailing about. Next one, Sally. Oh, this is just a picture. Archaeological pictures are always a bit vague, aren't they? Anyway, Cladh Hallan is made up of a series of houses. It's like a terrace of 3 round houses. And you can see the scale. They're like 5 to 7 meters across, these houses. They're semi-subterranean and people lived in them for a long period of time. If you go to UIST, there's a really good app now called UIST Unearthed. And if you go to the sites, it uses augmented reality to put the houses in front of you. So it's very exciting. And then the other site you can see is sort of showing you, basically that's a grassy plain with a load of lumps in it. And those were all called mounds. And once we dug into those mounds, we found what you can see in the lowest picture, which is basically a series of long houses. But what they kept doing was they kept sort of deconstructing and then rebuilding a new one, then taking that one apart, rebuilding a new one. But we had a series of long houses. So we know the Norse people are there. And you can see that both in terms of the date, but also the artifacts and things they take with them. Next one, Sally. So I think I swap over from Sally soon, but ultimately, I think what you can see, what we're showing you from this image is these are the 2 separate sites, and what you can see from one end to the other is basically one starts at the early Bronze Age, goes through to the early Iron Age, and then the other one goes to the Iron Age and goes up through to the Norse period. And what you're showing you, I think all you really need to see is there's quite a lot of bits of whale bone on the sites, okay? So can you see the blue bits are the bits that are made into stuff? Because what we'll tell you a bit more in a minute is you saw earlier, is whale bone's really good for making things. If you live in an environment where, for example, woodland resources are quite rare, and we know that the islands actually became less wooded pretty early on and never really recovered. Those of you who go to the islands today will notice there are no forests. Is that people will use bone and antler. It was kind of, you can think of it as like the plastic of the past. You would make things out of it. And whilst, you can think about making small things out of bone and antler, if you want to make something big, you really need a whale. So for example, at Scarra Brae, I was trying to find a photo earlier. There's evidence maybe of people using sperm whale ribs as kind of rafters for the roof. Because a whale is a fantastic resource when you get hold of it. So we only know that the species were there by looking for their remains, and in this case we've been looking at bits of bone. All right, so there's quite a lot of bits of bone, but some of them are quite small, as we'll discover. Move on, Sally. Yeah, so whenever we're looking at any species, but it holds true for whales and dolphins and anything else, is you want to know what animals there are, okay? And then we kind of think, well, what are they using them for? And then we think about how did they get them? So I don't know how many of you are aware, but for example, under the International Whaling Commission rules, you're not allowed to whale for a whole series of species. But one of the things you are allowed to do is continue with subsistence whaling. And subsistence whaling is whaling, so the whalers of the Northwest Pacific, for example, will go out and hunt like a grey whale every 5 years or 10 years. I've lost track of when they last hunted one. People will be given permission to go and hunt because it's actually part of their culture and their ethos. So even though sometimes this seems like a kind of a technical thing that we're looking back and wondering about, this sort of evidence does still inform conservation management decisions today. And actually, I did do a whole bunch of research around who used what evidence and how accurate it was quite some time ago. But so even though it seems like, do we care nowadays? We do, because people will use this evidence to try to present it to the IWC to support subsistence whaling. And of course, the other thing is we're always interested in how kind of relationships between humans and animals developed and what sort of strategies we're using, and then I guess what effects we had. All of this stuff we're talking to you about today really occurs before any of the major whaling impacts. The major whaling impacts only came much later with the introduction of big fleets and harpoon whales. We're talking about here would be, I suppose, in prehistory. I've just told you there's not many boats, so there's not that many people going out. You might have people in small boats and kind of kayaks or imiaks going out. And but by the time you get to the Norse period, those people are seafaring, so they might have larger boats. But in terms of actual sort of major impacts on any marine community, I suppose they did do quite a lot for the walruses, though, didn't they? the chances are that they weren't making a major impact. But again, this is one of the questions that we're trying to look at. We're trying to find out whether people were just utilizing stranded materials or whether they were actually out hunting for them. And then if they got them, what were they doing with them when they got them? Next one, Sally. So there's a couple of problems that we have. So one of the big issues with whalebone, with the whales, is that they're so big. Okay, so if a blue whale washes up tomorrow, let's go for a sperm whale, they're more commonly wash up. If we always trotted down to the beach and we wanted to use bits of the sperm whale, you could probably guarantee that we wouldn't bother taking the bone back. Because what do we want the bone for? We might want the blubber, we might want the meat, and we'd go home and we definitely have to invite all our friends around to eat it, or we'd have to try and store it somewhere. But one of the things that we can't, we don't really need is the bone, because we're not for food anyway. But what we do find out is that, as I said, people love whalebone because you can make things out of it. And so what happens is people will take whalebone home and then they'll do things to it. And that means it ends up being fragmented. And because it's fragmented, it actually gets into bits that we can't identify really well. And also, the more fragmented they become, the harder it is to count. Yeah. And also, if you have a really big thing and you chop into lots of tiny bits, it's very hard to identify as a small bit of a giant thing. So there's lots of issues around identifying whalebone because of the fact that it is rarely taken to sites intact. Often when it is taken to sites, it is then further utilized if people like to make it into things. That's one thing. The other thing is actually there's very poor guides to whalebone. There's lots and lots of guides to tell you, as you know, I don't all know, how to identify a whale while it's still got its flesh on, and you can see what color it is or its behavior and things like that. But when it starts rotting, I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of every now and then there's something in the paper, isn't there, going, my God, what is it? It's a monster from the deep. And you can normally guarantee it's a rotting whale that somebody's misidentified. And kind of because of that, there aren't that many good guides for whalebone. Some of the best ones are actually kind of made in, I think it's like 18 something. And the best thing is they're like A3 books in order to kind of identify the whale of these enormous volumes you have to turn over. But they're not really good modern guides. The situation has improved better. Has improved recently because people have become more interested in it. But when I first started trying to identify whale bones, I was using, yes, an 18th century, 19th century massive book, which was actually not a very good resource. So there's lack of guides. There's lots of species look quite similar. Taking your samples to a museum to have them analysed. Sometimes they're so large you can't put them all in your bag and go on the train with them. And then if you want to find somewhere where they're storing all the specimens, they're generally stored in a warehouse that can be quite hard to get to. So, for example, the British Museum, it does look like work for her, yes. The British Museum one is somewhere in deepest London, South London, isn't it, in a massive warehouse. And then the one in Edinburgh is in Granton. I mean, you have to have a reasonable amount of space to be able to store these things. So it's actually quite hard to identify them because there's not very good books, there's not very good resources, and it's really hard to take stuff to them, go to them. The other thing is it's also really hard to move them because they're so big. Sometimes, like, I had a blue whale, bit of a blue whale humerus. Oh yeah, top of a blue whale humerus. When you're trying to move something, you have to have somebody else to hold it while you're trying to compare it with your kind of game of snap. Okay. And counting, as I said, is a problem because you can get lots of tiny bits of bone from the same animal. So then you can't work out whether they've got one whale or thousands of one whale in 1,000 pieces or thousands of whales in individual pieces. Next one, Sally. So this is one of the things that we have been working upon. So I'm going to let Sally talk to you about this because this is her baby. Yes, so I think Sally's adequately demonstrating there the challenges of even photographing whale bone assemblages. Was this in Iceland?
Yeah, that's the narwhal in Iceland. Yeah,
that's a narwhal in Iceland. Yes.
Yeah,
anyway,
Jacqui took that as we were taking photos for our guide. So yeah, I'll just follow on from what Jacqui was saying. So we like Jacqui said, one of the big problems is identifying what species are there on the site, and one of the major issues with that is the lack of comparative morphological guides for kind of bones for whales. So we started gathering measurements from museum collections all around the North Atlantic, really. So this one, this is what we were doing in Iceland, but we also went around Norway and to the institutions in the UK and to a few other places. And we came up with a list of measurements which are based on the way that the different species have evolved and based on the kind of differences between species, which can be reliably used to differentiate between the different species which you find within UK waters, at least in North Atlantic waters. So we looked at about 31 different species. So you can see the measurements that we took here. So this is the centrum, the sort of circular cylindrical bit of the bone, and then you've got the processes coming off it, and the different dimensions of these essentially reflect a series of different things, but it's basically the ways in which they differ relate to the ways in which cetaceans have evolved for life underwater. So it primarily relates to swimming style, because that's, you know, a lot of the muscles along the spine are used in locomotion. So that's the way that the bones have evolved, and that in turn helps us identify what it is that we're looking at. So we've collected like tens of thousands of measurements of these bones, which was really good fun. And we run a Facebook page where we identify bits of bone that if people send us photos, we can sort of tell. If they just take a couple of measurements, sometimes we can tell what species it is. So that's a link there to our Facebook page and the page itself. So these are some of the measurements that we collected. This is what we did with them, so that they're kind of useful to us. So basically we've created a series of graphs which show, using ratios, what key relative dimensions of whalebone are. So for example, for vertebra, it really matters, or a key thing that evolved differently really early on was different approaches to elongation of the spine. So whales generally, they evolved from kind of short-backed animals to they got longer and longer in some cases, and their ways of achieving that differ between family groups, really. So in some family groups, you get elongation of the vertebrae themselves. So if you can picture, with the unusual stranding event with the beaked whales, you can see that in beaked whales, they've got really, really long centra, whereas within like dolphin species, so you can see these, particularly the oceanic dolphins and the porpoise, they've got really, really, really short centra. They're like discs, really. So using just relative centrum, that's a really good way that we can just easily distinguish between families, at least. But then we can also, there are tons of, using the measurements on that slide, there are tons of different ratios that we can kind of come to, which means something in relation to the way that the cetaceans have evolved. So this is a really handy one, because white-beaked dolphin is really, really similar to lots of other dolphin species, especially white-sided dolphin, like based on the vertebrae, but you can actually use the neural process height, so this height, and you can compare it with the centrum length, and essentially that enables you to get an idea of how stable different regions of the spine are. And it's the white-beaked dolphin has got the most extreme evolutionary adaptation to high stability, and that just means that the muscles have got an area of really high stability to kind of hold on to, so it relates to swimming style. But you can see that in the bone, and we can use it for identification. So that compares, so basically white-beaked dolphins have got really, really, really short centrum lengths and really high processes, which means that it's really inflexible within the kind of lumbar region. So that's like your middle back here, which is kind of a good site for muscle attachments. And it's we can use that for ID. But there are loads of different things that kind of came up as we were looking at the data, which enabled us to identify different species. So like beaked whales wise, you can identify Sowerby's beaked whale by the ends of the transverse processes. They're different from all other beaked whales, and there's all sorts of bits that you can use to identify.
Yeah, so Sally, just to explain, so can you see the way of the measurements, for example, the colours run in lines?
Oh yeah,
that's because we looked at every single vertebra, because remember, cetacea have quite a lot of vertebra. In fact, quite often they've thrown in a few extra. They stick some together, often at their neck. They actually fuse all their neck vertebra together. But then what we've been doing is thinking, well, if we just found a vertebra, what are the dimensions of it that we could use to identify it from any other vertebra of that species? So we had to look at all of the different vertebrae down the spine and measure them all, and then kind of model them all. So it's a way of describing shape and kind of work out kind of how similar things are through looking at the kind of shape by using measurements, I guess.
Yeah, because it also gets rid of the issue. There's like huge size variation, obviously, from younger ones to older ones. And if you look at the relative dimensions, it kind of gets rid of that. They all generally plot the same, except for some of the dolphin species change ratios as well as they grow up, but that's just a
pesky dolphins.
Yes.
Pesky dolphins.
It's, I think, related to the fact that they've really recently kind of evolved separately. Yeah, they're unusual. But for the rest of them, they stay the same as they grow up, which is kind of handy for us, because it means we can identify babies as well as the
because quite often, so if you think about the skeleton of a cetacean, what you really have is a head. Okay, you have a big head, then you have lots and lots of spine, and then you actually have what are relatively small limb bones, and obviously you have no, have a vestigial pelvis and no hind limbs. And a lot of what we tend to find that survives quite well, that has kind of recognizable structures to it, is the vertebra. So being able to identify the vertebra is actually very useful for us. Skulls, particularly the big whale skulls, they tend to get chopped up. They're kind of chopped up, even if people are carrying them, they're probably chopping them up. And the limb bones, I guess, fairly rarely actually go back. But I mean, people in prehistory, they loved a vertebra. They particularly loved a sperm whale vertebra, didn't they? A big vertebra would just make them happy. They'd run home with it under their arms, I can tell you. Yeah, we've got one in a box and it just fits the whole box, haven't we? And people quite often use them as kind of chopping blocks, but they're so common. Luckily for us, they're quite common. And luckily for us, they survive quite often holding their shape because they're quite dense, because they're, the important bit in the whale. And then that allows us to work out which species they come from.
It does, yes. So that's kind of the morphology side that we looked at. So like Jackie says, we focused mostly on vertebrae, but for most of the collections that we had, that it was all fragmented really. So of the like 3,000 bits of bone from both sites, there was only a small proportion of it was identifiable in any form using morphology, because it was mostly just small fragments. So because of that, we used a different technique, which is called zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry. And essentially you look at the collagen. So bone is made up of mineral and organic content, and the organic content contains, a big part of it is collagen, which is, like you find in your skin and other things. And that we can use, because of the way collagen is made of amino acids, so they're the kind of building blocks of it. And then the amino acids build up and they form chains of peptides. And then the peptide chains connect together and they form the collagen fibrils. So what we can do is put the bone through a process where we essentially get rid of the mineral content. So we put it in acid really, and it gelatinizes it, and that's how we get the collagen out. And then we can cut it down with particular enzymes which allow you to break down the collagen into peptides. And then because there have been differences have evolved in the amino acid sequences, and amino acids have different weights, we can essentially weigh the peptide chains and work out what species we're looking at through comparison with known collagen, known peptide weights. So the whole process is called zooms. So we did that on hundreds and hundreds of samples from the site. So you can see some of when you put your sample through a mass spectrometer and you measure the time it takes to get from one end. So you bang a laser at it and you measure the time it takes from get to one end of the mass spectrometer to the other end of the mass spectrometer. And that relates to the weight of the peptide, and that's what we measure and look at and analyze. So you can see. Yeah.
So isn't it one's your sample and one's like your standard, isn't it?
I'm comparing two. So this one, yeah, normally, yeah.
What are you doing here, this one?
I'm just showing two different species, so showing that you can see. So you would do that, yeah. You would compare your sample with
a known one. So somebody will have gone and run this process on a known species. It would have got the sperm whale that you know is a sperm whale because it was still weighing its flesh, when you got it. And people run that through and you get basically the signal. Then you use this other method and you get the other signal. And then you essentially have a library of cetaceans and you get your data out and you go, which one is it? And the differences are in these kind of spectra. So you're looking at the little peaks and troughs.
And you can see the difference here. So this is a key one. This is kind of the area of one peptide, and it's the amino acids have changed in some species. So it's actually, this one is a sperm whale underneath and this one is a blue whale on top. You can see sperm whale's got the marker here, but blue whale's a little bit further back. So you can use that to differentiate what you're looking at, which is handy. So this is the data that we got back from both sites. So using both techniques, we identified just tons and tons of different species on both sites, really. So the main one at Cladh Hallan was that we had absolutely tons of sperm whale, but like Jacqui says, most of it's fragmentary, so we don't know whether we've got, although we've got a lot of small pieces, they still might all come from one animal, and they were all in the late Bronze Age, which is so you can see late Bronze Age here. It's all the blue stuff here, so you see hundreds of fragments.
It does mean they were, if it is one whale, they were kept using or reusing that one whale for hundreds of years, if you see what I mean. Because at whatever time it is, this is generations. You can think of each of those numbers of generations. So is it that they got one sperm whale and they just carried on using it, or was it that they kept nipping down and getting more sperm whales? That's one of our questions.
Yeah, I'd really like to do DNA on the bone so we can see whether there's more than one individual present. So yeah, that would just be very, very good to know. But as well as the sperm whale, you've also got blue whale in the early Iron Age, and like a range of other species, lots of big species. So fin whale, humpback whale, balanid's probably right whale, as well as small species. So pilot whale, killer whale, and lots of different dolphin species as well. And then at Bornais, so the late Iron Age to Norse site, there's also quite a lot of sperm whales. It's still the blue here, as well. This represents one really fragmented bit of mandible, and then a range of other species. But you can see that the species are present in. There's a more even distribution between the other species rather than just kind of lots being kind of represented by small amounts. You've got a few of each different type. And again, you've got the big ones like the right whale and the humpback whale, and blue whales and fin whales, as well as the smaller dolphin species. So sperm whale is most common across both sites, but there are a huge range of species. So then we looked into how the different species we use. This slide looks hideously complicated, but all it's showing is that those large species are collected to one side of the graphs, and the smaller species are collected towards the other side. And the colours represent the different uses to which the bone from the different species was put. So we've got the larger species. You can see there's more of the green, which represents unworked fragments. It's really not common for the smaller species to have been present in unworked fragment form. But instead there are more unworked elements within the smaller species, which suggests that they're just bringing the bones back and they're not doing anything else with them for the smaller species. But the larger species, there's much more working going on, which is leading to the fragments. And then the artifacts are the blue ones, and they're found in all different species, which is quite cool. So this is the tooth that Jacqui was talking about. She wants to rob, and then the other bones as well. So this is some of the uses to which they were put. So this is fragmentary bone. This one's probably been used as a pot lid, because you can see it's a sperm whale vertebra disc from the ends of the vertebra. You can see it's all blackened, which probably means it's been put over a pot. And then there's the comb as well. So I'm just going to show you a few more pictures of some really cool artifacts. Yeah, this is just kind of an example of the range of different things that we're getting from both of the sites. So this is possibly, well, it's interpreted as a loom make weight, but it's really light. So we're still not sure what some of the artifacts are used for. But typically, when whalebone is perforated through the centre, it's usually interpreted as it's been kind of suspended from something like a thread or something like that. So you can get like loom weights and spindle whales and things like that. So that's a caudal vertebra. You can see the two little foramen, which you can see in unworked bone as well. We did zooms on that one. And this is a humpback whale. So this is a phalange from a humpback whale that's been worked. So you're missing one end, but the other flat end is there, and they're the kind of really characteristic hourglass shape. They're really beautiful. But it's one of the few examples of bits of long bone that we found on the sites. This is fin whale. This is a lovely comb from late Norse deposits at Bornais. And then this is a pilot whale, and it's been hollowed out to form a kind of cup, which is a really common type of artifact found on just all of the Scottish Island sites. And then we've got right whale plaque. There's a range of different interpretations for that. So if anybody's got any ideas of what it's used for, then shout. There's a really similar one made of sperm whale bone as well from Middle Norse deposits. And then comb making was quite a big industry at Bornais in the Norse period. And it's mostly antler that's used, but there are some whalebone examples. So this is a sperm whale blank for comb making. And this is a right whale one, I think. which looks like it's been used to test out different techniques for decoration.
Yeah, the famous ring and dot motif. Yeah, I mean, and one of the interesting things, sorry, go back a minute, Sally, is that if people are trying to make sort of good artifacts, quite often they'll use mandible, because if you've ever looked at cetacean skulls or ribs, quite often they're not particularly robust. They're kind of got lots of cancellous bone. Quite often they're quite a thin kind of compact bone on the outside. But one thing that actually is always really well built in a whale is its mandible, and that's obviously because it's the business end, isn't it? And so I first became aware of this because I was talking to somebody who worked in New Zealand, and they pointed out that in New Zealand you get these rather beautiful sort of ceremonial kind of, ceremonial axes. And she said, oh, well, talk to the Maori, they're all made out of whale mandible. And in fact, quite a lot of the items you're looking at, we can't tell what element it is, but you can kind of tell by the density that it's the whale mandible that people are actually seeking out to make these artifacts out of.
So that this is whale mandible. You can see it's not, you can't see it in the picture, but on the reverse you can see the foramen that are in the mandible, so you can tell on that one, but mostly you can't. I think this is mandible too, just due to density. But
yeah, and I think the other comb is just because it's just its density, because normally it doesn't have that kind of density that you would get. It doesn't really have thick bone. If you think about your bones, or bones of anything you eat, quite often they have a kind of a very dense bit with a kind of hollow bit in the middle. In whales, it's all generally filled with kind of the honeycomb with a very small bit of outside, so it doesn't offer that much good stuff to make fine items out of, unless you're going for bits of the skull.
Yeah, so this, oh, there you go, that's the sperm whale one, so next to the right whale one, and some more artifact types, and this is the one at the bottom. I'm going to start whizzing through because I'm aware we're running out of time a bit, but these are some artifact types that we have no idea what they are. It's a edge of a vertebra disc, they've kind of rounded and they've clipped the edge basically, and rounded it off, and they're all different species, but we don't know what they're for, so if anybody's got any idea, goes down. So meat, so that's an example of how the bone is used for artifacts. So meat was also probably used on the site, mostly from dolphins and porpoises, and we can see examples of this in the cut marks, which are on this this small dolphin bone from Cladh Hallan. So this is one of the areas where the muscles kind of attach to. So you can see that they've been cutting away at that with those tiny little cut marks there, which is interesting. And so although the bone record shows that smaller species were used for meat, there was actually Matt Law, who did his PhD on the mollusks from the site, found a humpback whale barnacle in a time in one of the periods. I can't remember, it was from the Norse period, but I can't remember specifically which one, when there's no humpback whale bone on the site at all, but he found the barnacle, which indicates the presence of the flesh, so either blubber or meat, which is really, really cool. And then ivory, so we've got quite a bit of ivory on the sites as well, particularly in the late Norse period at Bornais. And this is just a lovely quote from one of the 13th century sources. So in the late Norse period, there's more ivory than in earlier periods, and we think it probably relates to a kind of general trend of using marine ivory for artifacts in this period. So you can see this dice is from a sperm whale, but you can see they've had a go at an orca tooth here as well, where they're obviously trying to work this. And there's also beaked whale teeth on the site from the same period. And this is a Norwegian text which shows how they're valuing sperm whale teeth at this time. So this is contemporary with what's being found on the site. And it really nicely mentions chessmen, which obviously there's Lewis chessmen found on Lewis, and they're about the same period as well. So it all kind of, it really nicely ties together, which is rare. So the reason we're going on again to a different use of the bone. So whales are, they've got a really, most of them, many of them have got a really thick blubber layer, particularly the larger species, which would have been a really good source of oil or fuel. But the bones are also really oil rich, particularly in some of the larger species. So this is all examples of sperm whale. And we think this is possibly the reason that so much fragmentary bone is turning up from the larger species, and where we can identify what element it's from, it's tending to be from skulls. So these are both skull fragments from sperm whales. Sperm whales have got a really unusual structure within their skulls, which is this it's like super honeycomb, but then there's this kind of, there's lots of linear arrangements within the structure, and then it just goes to these really big ones, like, you know, when the ground freezes and it kind of lifts itself up in those like stringy bits. It's like that, that's directly next to the kind of other linear structure, which is interesting and really diagnostic. So we think possibly what they're doing is extracting oil from these bones, and that's the reason that they're ending up so fragmented. There's also quite a bit of burnt bone that's showing that. And this is an artifact which has been used as a lamp, which is, or indicates it's been used as a lamp because of the burning, which is again sperm whale skull, which is an oil-rich species, which is kind of all tying together to suggest that they were doing this. So this is one we're getting towards the end now. This is Cladh Hallan. So I'm just going to show you another thing that we looked at as well. So because we analysed quite a lot of bone with the Zoom samples from across the site, what we're able to do is build up an idea of the distributions of different species in different periods. So you can see these are all fragments of just sperm whale bone. You can see they're kind of spread throughout all of the houses in quite a lot of the different phases, which potentially, if you think about, whales are a really, really huge animal, and there's lots of kind of ethnographic evidence from around the world which suggests that people come together to use the resources when a whale strands. So people will go and exploit it all together, because it would be just too much really for one person to kind of take on that by themselves. It would take them a very, very long time. So they do tend to represent social events where people come together to do this. So we think possibly what the distribution of bone across the houses might suggest is people actually sharing the oil. So a sperm whale has been acquired one way or another. We're not going to talk about hunting today because it's just a whole other thing, and it takes a long time to go through the evidence. But it's likely that they were stranded because it's the late Bronze Age. So it's come ashore probably, and then they might have gone out to exploit it and bring the bone back to the houses and then share it between the houses. What's also really interesting is that House 401, which is this one in the centre, is kind of higher status than the others, and there's a kind of a few indications of that, like evidence for bronze working and things, and it's actually got the lowest number of fragments in a couple of phases, which I mean, it could indicate a few things, but one of the things that it could suggest is that they've got preferential access to some of the more easily accessible fuel resources from the sperm whale. So things like the ambergris or the blubber, they might have preferential access to that. And this house also, there is slight differences in the way that they're in their access to the whale bones. There are a lot more species present within this house compared with the other houses, which is kind of interesting, and does suggest something slightly different going on there. Yeah, those are some of the remains from Cladh Hallan. So looking at what to do next, this is the last slide, I think. We're kind of aware, because of the range of different species that we've got. So we've got things like grey whale and right whale. So grey whale are now extinct within UK waters, and right whale is critically endangered kind of globally, but it's possible that right whale had critical habitat within UK waters prior to this. And this is kind of one of the things that's within current conservation management plans. So because of that, that means we've got evidence which can potentially provide some information to feed into general knowledge about these species, which could potentially help whale conservation. And likewise, we've also got bones from the orcas, so the West Coast communities now facing extinction. It's a fairly low number of animals, isn't it? And there are bones on the site which could potentially help us to find out more information about these animals and other species as well, which could help in their conservation. So an example of that, I've just been picking up on species which have facing distinct threats now. But we've actually been working with ecologists and cetacean population specialists to study sperm whale and bottlenose dolphin demographic history and phylogeography, and they're looking at things like past diet. So they're able to analyse the isotopes from the animals, from the bone, and look at what they were eating at different periods. And that there's kind of many more things that you can do with these as well. So I've just cherry picked some of the most interesting things from the assemblages here, just to show you kind of a flavour of what's going on the sites. And some of the other things that we're going to be going on to research or do is develop the identification guide. So the graphs that we've shown you before, we're kind of keen to develop something that is usable. So if anybody's got any thoughts on stuff that might be useful beyond archaeology, that would be really great, because we're kind of developing it now. So if we could have input, that would be fantastic. And if anybody's got any suggestions for anything more that we should do, then that would be great too. There's work bone research, which Jacqui, that's your area. I don't know if you want to say anything on that.
No, I was just going to say, the other thing we should say is that our colleagues on Orkney, so Martin Carruthers, that are sort of slightly later site than Cladh Hallan, they have done some DNA analysis, haven't they, on the whale from that particular site. And they did demonstrate this. I think most of it is one species, one individual.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they then sort of tie that to kind of, I don't know, like a bounty, either an omen or a bounty, you know, the kind of a whale washing up. And that maybe that affected what people did on the site, because the sort of bounty arrives. Because Sally and I did do some work. We didn't get to go though, did we? We did look at some whale bone from Tierra del Fuego.
We did, yeah.
And again, they have ethnographic evidence there that when a whale is beached, then people do come together, and basically everybody gets together, everybody has a big feast, and they all skip off back with their kind of whale party packs, and then kind of eat it all at home, you know. So there is still quite a bit of work that we can do looking at the material. So both in terms of, I guess, conservation, identification, community engagement, and a variety of other aspects. So I think, is that the end, Sally?
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
There we are. We have a thank you slide.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for having us.